Are live.
I mean, it's okay. We are recording, by the way. I hope that's okay. Hi, everyone. We'll just give people a few minutes to join us, and then we'll start. Okay, I think I'm gonna start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Michal Deckel. I'm the director of the Rifkind Center for the Humanities here, or not here, sort of somewhere in the virtual world, CCNY. We are a center that hosts talks and conferences in a wide range of areas, and I urge you to check out our website, rifkindcenter.com, to get on our mailing list and follow us on social media. I should say before we turn to this event that our next event is going to be on April 12th, and it's going to focus on memorializing slavery. It will feature Emily Rabbito, who is a writer at CCNY, historian Ana Lucia Araujo, who writes on slavery memorialization from Howard University, and the philosopher Susan Neiman, who is the author of a recent book called Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. So please join us for that as well. This afternoon, we have three just absolutely wonderful scholars who are going to discuss an absolutely wonderful book. And I guess I am somewhat biased because Gil Hochberg is my friend, and I think she's my brilliant friend. And we will be talking about her book, Becoming Palestine. I'll introduce I'll introduce Gil and then our two respondents. The way this afternoon will work is Gil will speak very briefly, then Diana, and then Ziad, and after which they will respond, they will ask their questions, and we will open the virtual floor to you people. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A and I will read it. I also want to remind you that Becoming Palestine is on sale, and Duke University Press has graciously given us a kind of discount for people who attend this talk. You have the coupon link in the email for this talk. So Gil Hochberg is the Ransford Professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature and Middle East Studies at Columbia University. She's also a fellow chair. She's chair of MISIAS at Columbia. She has published on a wide range of issues, including Francophone literature, the modern Levant, Hebrew literature, Israeli and Palestinian cinema, Mediterraneanism, and trauma and narrative. She's the author of 3 books. The first one, In Spite of Partition, Jews, Arabs, and the Limits of Separatist Imagination, from 2007, Visual Occupations, Vision and Visibility in a Conflict Zone, from 2015, and Becoming Palestine, Toward an Archival Imagination of the Future, which is the subject of today's event. Diana B. Greenwald is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the City College of New York. Her research focuses on nationalism, conflict, and state building, with a particular focus on the Middle East, or rather on contemporary Palestinian politics more specifically. She has published essays in PS, Political Science and Politics, Mediterranean Politics, The National Interest, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, among other venues, and her current book project draws on field-based research and original data to examine how Israel's regime of indirect rule in the West Bank shapes Palestinian politics on the local level. Ziad Abu-Rish is Associate Professor of Human Rights and Director of the MA program in Human Rights and the Arts at Bard College. It's hard to say that, human rights and the arts, right? Ziad is co-editor of a few anthologies: The Dawn of the Arab Uprising, End of an Old Order from 2012, Critical Voices, a collection of interviews from and on the Middle East from 2015, and What is Political Economy from 2016. He has published articles and book chapters in various places, including Middle East Report, Review of Middle East Studies, and his current book project is titled The State of Lebanon, Popular Politics and Institution Building in the Wake of Independence. I should also say that this event is co-sponsored by the Center for Middle East and Middle Eastern American Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center, and I want to thank its director, Beth Barron, for co-sponsoring with us. So Gil, I will turn to you and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you so much. First, thank you to Michal, and also thank you to Beth, both of whom organized, facilitated, and brought this event to life. So I want to thank the Rifkind Center for the Humanities and the Arts and the Middle East and Middle Eastern American Center at the Graduate Center, CUNY. My greatest gratitude to Diana Greenwald and to Ziad Abu-Rish for putting the time, the effort, the engagement. It means the world to me. And I couldn't think of better interlocutors to be here with me today. So thank you all. And thank you for the invisible, but always already noticeable audience that is with us today. I am very much hoping to hear from you. When one gives talks after a book is out, there is this eagerness to hear, what others think about it, because you already put all the thoughts that you had, or you think that you've maxed your thoughts. And what is amazing is that I've noticed over this short period since the book was published, how much I learn from readers of the book. A lot of new perspectives and thoughts. You work on something and you think, I've thought it all through, or I thought every aspect of it. And suddenly somebody comes up with a question, a new perspective that it never occurred to you to think about the same questions from that perspective. So I truly hope that I'll get some interaction with the audience. So I'm going to take a short time to present, I guess, what is sort of the core essence for me of the book. It's not an easy task because, you work on a book for about 5 years. I do have to say and admitted this audience that when I first saw the book, I sort of just thought to myself, how is it possible that it is so skinny? I have worked on this for 5.5 years. So the nice thing about it being skinny is that it's not expensive and it's very light. But what I wanted really to say is that it's very hard to spend a short 10 minutes discussing a project of so many years, but I'll do my best. I'm going to start with the way that the book itself starts, with my own quote, which is, "Becoming Palestine is a book about archival imagination of and for the future." So this is really the essence and also the subtitle of the book. And what I want to emphasize by this are a few things. The first and foremost is the sort of temporal aspect that is central to the book. So this is a book about archival imagination rather than about archives themselves, although there is a lot of engagement with the concept of the archive and also with particular archives. But what I mean by this is that in general, when people think about archival work, academically or otherwise, they think about how archives are used in a historical way or past-oriented way. This is the case in Palestine, but of course not only in Palestine, where archives are weighted for, in the sense, for example, in the case of Palestine, you have Israeli state archives or IDF archives, that part of them include a lot of confiscated Palestinian material and Palestinian archives, and people await for the time in which archives open, a certain period passed, and then the archive opens and people can go into the archive and find historical details or quote unquote proof of past events, crimes, atrocities, state violence, etc. Becoming Palestine is different in the sense that I sort of encourage us to go through a time bender maneuver in relation to the archive. And I suggest that we need to learn to use archives, not just as access to a past or access to proof and facts, but actually as a gateway to the future. In this sense, you know, the kind of, you could say, my negating argument is that what I'm suggesting is that, at least in the context of Palestine, there remains very little redemptive political or ethical affect or effect to the archive as a source of historical knowledge, in the sense that, not that facts themselves don't matter, of course they do, but that the actual discovery or that moment of aha, discovery lasts for a very short time and then rests right back into an accumulation of previous aha moments. And the main problem with it is that all of those facts that are discovered, all of the aha moments discovered in the archive or the historical archive, build up and amount to what I call archival fatigue, because the secrets that are found are secrets that are always already known. At least they have been known and circulated as oral information and knowledge among Palestinians. I mean, since the Nakba and beforehand. So it's, again, not that facts don't matter, but that the performance of discovery ends up functioning in a way that seems more like a repetition compulsion than any kind of opening a horizon. And that results, I think, not just in not useful accumulation of knowledge, but actually harmful, in the sense that there really is a fatigue of source, and that fatigue leads to stagnation, and with time, the reaction to these aha moments actually becomes less and less and less powerful. So what does one do in relation to the historical archive, or the central historical archive? I think there's many answers, very good ones to that. So, for example, Laura Kang writes about the importance of addressing the undemocratic character of the historical argument. Saidiya Hartman, whose work is very important to me, writes about the need for critical fabulation as a means of overcoming the erasure in the historical archive, right? So the need to actually fabricate, so to speak, missing information that doesn't make it to the archive. And I'm suggesting that one of the other ways to approach the issues, and the issues around the archive in Palestine and out of Palestine, but in Palestine it's perhaps very visible and in its acuteness, are not just issues of fatigue, but also issues of inequality and inequality in access. This results in somewhat of a bitter irony in which everybody ends up being dependent on the IDF's archives, right? Or when do the IDF or the Israeli state archives open in order to access even Palestinian archival information? And so what you see is, for example, films like Rona Sellas, that is all built on the discovery of Palestinian documents, films, photography, and it's a wonderful project. It's a very important project. Alas, at the end of it, at the thank yous, inevitably there is, and thank you to the IDF, because it is they are the source of the information. They are the archive. So I suggest that we need to rethink the temporality of the archive in order to learn how to learn our living present as an archive, rather than needing to depend on historical archive. And I can explain a little bit more about this in Q&A. But when I say learn to read the living present as an archive, I mean two things. One is, of course, that the living present, our reality, is always fueled with traces of the past. So you find that easily. In the case of Palestine, of course, you find ruins and etc. of destruction. But more significantly, perhaps, I'm suggesting that the present also is filled with hidden traces of potential hidden futures. And that's perhaps my main theoretical interventions. What I mean by that is that the present, or the potential futures that the present holds, lie outside of the visible order of things, which is Foucault's term, or invisible to the conditions of the possible, Ariella Azoulai's term. We're made not to be able to see that. We're made not to be able to find those traces of the future, because they sit outside of the archive, understood again as Foucault's term, as the order of things. This leads me to the second point I want to emphasize, which is, I kind of touched on it already, but it is the need to rely less on the official state archive. And again, we have had lots of, within the theoretical discussion of the archive and archives, there's been lots of discussions of how to read state archives, so the undermine state power. So you have a reading against the grain or along the grain, to use Anne Solar's term. But I'm suggesting that we need to give less authoritative power to these archives and take significantly more seriously alternative minor archives. And those include all kinds of archives: refugee archives, diasporic archives, feminist, queer, all kinds of various artistic endeavors, the ones that do not actually find themselves in the quote unquote state archive, but they also don't take centralized state power as their state of departure. And in that sense, I also suggest that they are more relevant and more in time with the times. We do live at the moment in, all of us live in an archive saturated era, right? We live in a digital era. We live in a huge database. And it's sort of sometimes surprising to me to see that theories or that debates in, the theories of the archive and the relationship of power and archive are still very much centralized on the question of the state and access to the archive. And of course, it's not that that doesn't matter anymore. And of course, we all know that there are various states and various situations in which those remain the main issues to address, the simple inability to access archival information. At the same time, we have to take into consideration the fact that de facto we do live in a democratization state of the archive, because there is a major plurality of archives. It is up to us to decide what is our sources of information. We can decide that the only accessible important source of information are the state archives, but it really is not the case, in the sense that knowledge has never been easier to generate and to circulate. And I want to suggest that all of the artists, we'll get to what art means for me, but all of the artists, the Palestinian artists that I discuss in this book, are generators of archives. They make archives. And so the main shift, I suppose, in methodology is, or what I sort of call on my fellow scholars to do, is to engage those archives, because they are filled with information. They are filled with archival information. And the archival information is both directed at the past, but primarily directed, I suggest, at unveiling futures that we are not meant to see, and that in truth we won't see in the state archive ever. We can look there, but those kinds of future and possibilities we won't find there. And this indeed brings me to the third point that I wanted to make, which is the importance of art for me and for my project. So the various chapters of this book all are built on very close engagement, close readings with various artistic forms: essay, films, literature, dance, conceptual art, photography. My own training was in comparative literature, and my first book is a very good comparative literature kind of good student comparative literature project. It's only literature because I remember that's what I learned, that literature matters and the rest doesn't. The second book, I freed myself because I did write about the visual politics of the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in this book, I really sort of just rejected all notion of disciplinary regulation of the differentiation of the how each one of the arts is allowed to be discussed, which is again a question of archival borders, the order of things, etc. So it engages all kinds of genres. My engagement with these works, and I'll mention, of course, the names of the artists, has been, I didn't know for a very long time that I was writing a book, as usually is the case. I was just marveled with these remarkable artistic projects. And it's not that I initially saw all the connections between them, but what I did see was shared by the different projects. And in terms of the artists, I'm engaging very closely with the works of Jumana Mana. Some of you may know some of them: Jumana Mana, Basil Abbas, Rawan Abu-Rahim, Emily Jassir, Stephen Sabella, Shuruk Harb, Kamal al-Jafari, Azal Hassam, Larissa Sansour, Farah Saleh, and Basma al-Sharif. There are others, but these are the main artists. And what I noticed is, what I did find in their very, very different project was that there was a certain kind of engagement either with archives or the concept of the archive, but in a way that was mischievous and irreverent, and at the same time very serious and committed. And I started to see that there is really not just an attempt to fight for an access to the main archive, or to use Said's word, not just a fight to have the right to narrate, but have the right to imagine and have the right to create one's own archive from one's own material, and not just one's own material, but to recycle and recirculate and cite and use recitation as a form of active engagement, right? So for example, in both Al-Jafari and Jumana Mana's essay films, the sort of archival source are actually either Israeli film footage, or this archive of Robert Lachmann, who was a German Jewish musicologist who spent a short time in Palestine, 1936 to 1940, when he passed away. But that his archive of notes and radio show and his recordings of He was an ethnomusicologist specialized in Arab music. That was his term. Jomana Mana engages that archive and creates her own recording, right? Her own archive of recordings on her own iPhone that is in dialogue with this very overtly, perhaps naive and anachronistic Orientalist kind of ethnomusicologist, and so both of them, these are example of artists who, instead of either dissing those archives aside or trying to find a voice elsewhere, they actually use these archives to regenerate alternative archives, very strong alternative archives. And so, I mean, I can't do justice to the work by describing them so briefly, but all in all, I would say that all of these artistic projects enable us to see the present itself as less immediately recognizable. They make us see the present through imagination. And the importance is that the potentiality of the present comes through as a form of citationality, to use Roland Barthes' word. And in this sense, it brings me to the title of the book, and that might be my last point, which is Becoming. And what is this becoming and becoming Palestine? I take the term, of course, from Gilles Deleuze's notion of becoming. The importance of becoming for Deleuze is, and of art for Deleuze, is that it is a form of thinking that he contrasts to a historical investigation. So the historical investigation focuses on the event, and it is a teleological mode of thinking in the sense that it is causal. There is an event and its outcome. Art or poetic thinking, which is the thinking of becoming for Deleuze, and I follow him in this sense, helps us release the present from this grip of history, this grip of the causal implications on our present. And it liberates, therefore, what he calls becoming. Becoming is a process of still in becoming, therefore not fully known, not fully visible, but in a process of becoming. And this is what I suggest all of these works enable us to do. And in this sense, they are offering us, I wouldn't say in no way a simple optimistic approach, but definitely a one that suggests that if we dare and we learn to imagine, we can open our possibilities. So I'll end by saying that the book really suggests that our main political task, and I don't mean this as an academic exercise, again, I do mean this very sincerely as a political and ethical commitment, that our goal is to learn to imagine. And it sounds simple, but we are, remember, told time and again that we need to be, especially as scholars, we need to be serious. We need to rely on historical facts. We need to be responsible, and responsibility means that, things are grounded in reality, etc. And imagination is for children, or it's something you do in your spare time. And my argument is that it's quite the opposite. There has not been a single political effective movement in the world that doesn't start with imagination. And as some of the artists, especially, I think Larissa Sansour's project shows, there isn't a better example for that than Zionism and the force of Zionist movement as a political force. The force is not found in historical facts. The force is found in the power of the narrative and the imaginative. In fact, what Larissa Sansour's film, in my reading, shows is that Zionism's power is found in the fact that it's one of the best science fiction ever written. And I want to take that very, very seriously and suggest art and artistic expression are indeed the source, not for some kind of something you do in your spare time, but that is where the source of political intervention lies. And I'll end by saying that I hope there will be more programs like the one that Ziad Abu-Rish is running in BARD, because I think I looked very closely into the program with adoration, because I think that is it. That is exactly the place for political intervention, human rights and art and curation. And curation is always archiving, and it is the creation of archives, and the creation of, to create archives is to create collectives. So that's where I will end. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Gil. And Deanna, I'll turn to you.
Great, thank you so much, Gil, and thank you the Rifkind Center and to the graduates' opportunity to engage with this fascinating work from Gil. I was just told my internet connection went a little funny, so hopefully everyone can hear me okay. So as a great. So as a reader of Becoming Palestine and as an interlocutor today, I should note that my own scholarly approach to Palestine is grounded in a very different tradition of social science and the, much dreaded rational actor theories and empirical inquiry. And as a political scientist, I've been heavily focused on political institutions and very contemporary local politics in Palestine and the West Bank specifically. So reading Becoming Palestine was really a welcome departure in many ways, and a journey into the creative and imaginative and as Jill was alluding to, this often transgressive work of Palestinian artists, including several that she mentioned and that she profiles in the book: Jumana Mana, Kamel El-Ja'fari, Larissa Sansour, Farah Saleh, Basel Abbas, and Luan Abu-Rahmeh. So I was really delighted to go on this journey, and not only to learn about the work of these artists, but also to read, Jill's sensitive and eloquent engagement with the work of these artists. So the artists' work themselves shines through in this book with brilliance throughout the book. But I also found Jill's analysis very provocative and captivating, and exploring these productive possibilities of, questioning, creating, and sort of liberating the archive. So in Becoming Palestine, she writes, Becoming Palestine is a process of activating archives that return us to the present, reminding us that the fictive, imaginative, utopian vision for the future is in fact already part of our present, albeit well guarded and hidden behind the politics of the status quo. So the writing is just very evocative and much more pleasant to read than a lot of the social science that I end up immersed in. I just want to kind of put out a few sort of threads and areas for discussion that emerged for me in reading this, that I look forward to discussing with you all and hearing Ziad's reflections as well and the audience. As I read, one kind of thread that continued to tease me throughout the book was this idea of identity and the individual versus, or perhaps as part of a collective, the idea of the nation and the kind of boundaries that relies on. And this idea of boundaries comes up, in some of these artists' work very directly. You mentioned Kamel Jafari's films that focus and really zoom in on walls and the role of walls in creating certain boundaries, not only between nations, but also between families and households. But also, you know, in this rejection of cultural purity that you see in Jumana Mana's work, where she's recreating this sound archive that you just mentioned, originally collected by this German Jewish ethnomusicologist, but she's recreating and sort of, in your reading, rejecting this cultural purity. Also in Larissa Sansour's films, as this quote unquote archaeologic terrorist narrator is attempting to deposit facts on the ground for future archaeologists to uncover, thereby, quote, creating a nation. So you ask in the introduction, Jill, for example, when we create an archive, alternative as it may be to state politics, do we assume a point of origin? Do we start with a pre-given we, whose collective past, memory, and history we seek to revive or restore? Or can the we serve as the end goal of archival creation? And so I would love to probe a little bit more in the discussion, you know, what this sort of challenging these ruling discourses of nation, of collective boundaries, of sovereignty, what that means for readers who think of Palestine as, you know, perhaps a territorially defined space, but also an idea that is steadfast under continual erasure and assault, and also as a nation, right? That's not itself temporally bounded, because it is by definition part of the past, present, and future, in a similar way that Zionists perhaps think of the Jewish nation as well. So that message kind of propels the analysis through the books. I'd love to hear
Deanna, we lost you. We don't hear you well.
a bit more engagement with that. Hear me now?
Deanna, can you repeat, because I think something happened with the internet.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think the point I made perhaps about the nation and these kind of boundaries, and the idea there is, you know, how should readers who think of Palestine in these national terms engage with this work? The second kind of thread or point that I wanted to follow was that this book comes as kind of I read, Jill, your analysis as sort of a challenge to the traditional endeavor of historians, who, as you just mentioned in your opening remarks, you know, moving beyond documenting or preserving or cataloging the past, but we're sort of bringing the archive out into the present, bringing it out basements and participants, as Abbas and Abu Rahme do with these tours that they bring Palestinian youth on through you know, destroyed and depopulated villages in 1948. So one question that came to mind for this kind of, if we're challenging this work of just historical recovery, what implications does that have for maybe commitments to restorative justice or reparative justice, and that we might pursue in the wake of, you know, atrocities such as the Nakba and in the wake of historical wrongdoing? So if we're thinking of the archive as not sort of temporally bounded anymore, and if we're even, you know, sort of problematizing these ideas of cause and effect, what does that mean for these kind of ideas of historical sequence and how those are implicated in sites of criminal destruction and actual events, criminal events that occur? And then the third point that I thought we could perhaps pick up on is I would love to hear more about how we should think about these radical acts of archival imagination and their own sightedness. So you've mentioned, you know, the democratization of the archive and the vast sort of digital universe that we all have access to now. But some of these works maybe are more designed to be more transient than others, or more ephemeral than others, whereas others are more permanent. So you mentioned, or you profile Farah Saleh's, you know, dance and performance and this kind of embodied type of archival imagination, which is obviously quite different from something that's, a piece of work that sits in a museum or in a gallery. So both in terms of its geographic kind of the siting of this archival imaginative work, both geographically but also temporally. So we've talked a lot of, you discussed kind of liberating the original archival resources, but then for those artists that are building on those, is their work designed for a specific audience geographically or temporally? So I will leave it there for initial questions. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Deanna. Gil, why don't you answer now, and then we'll go to Ziad.
Oh, should I address now and then? Oh, okay. Yeah,
I think so, or
that's fine. That's fine.
yeah.
So first, so Diana, thank you so much. And I'm glad to serve as a fresh air for the political scientist. So great questions. Let me start with the first, which is, yes, you have sensed very clearly that there is sort of a rejection of nationalism as the end goal or framework. I have to say that I don't think that I mean, my own opinions on this are aside, but I think that is a trend that I found in all of the works. And so in that sense, I engage with the works in their own terms. I do think, I mentioned this in the book. So there's two aspects to it. And one of them I think is important, and it is a generational sort of differentiation. I think we're talking about relatively all of these artists are younger artists. They're not all the same age, but they're younger artists. You can also probably, for those of you who are familiar with the artists, I would say that aside from Saleh, Shuruk also lives in Palestine, but most of the artists are diasporic, right? I mean, and I say that because they go back and forth, but they reside mostly out of Palestine. I think that, so you have both a generational difference and also kind of I think a diasporic or a kind of global vision to these questions. And I think it makes sense in many ways that all of these works that are profoundly decolonializing or decolonializing in their essence find that the replacement or the kind of nation as a framework or Palestine as a nation is insufficient as a vision, as a ground political vision. This is, I think, because they're actually following a tradition that you find already in Edward Said's work. It's a long legacy that insists on the fact that the fight for Palestine, that Palestine, in fact, yes, is a geographical area, but it's also more than that. It's a metaphor, it's a longing, it's a name, it's a history, it's a future. And I think there is a kind of a plea to use that power to do more than just create another nation, which would be to reverse, at this point, it would be to reverse the reality of Zionism. Of course, in terms of political solutions, I think there are various political pragmatic solutions that that this vision would have to come to terms with in terms of what kind of nation, etc. But yes, there is a commitment, both mine in terms of a theoretical presentation and in the artist's engagement, to think beyond the nation, and to think beyond the nation state that, currently remains, of course, the maybe only political and agency in our world, but there's not a day where we see that it is a force of all legitimate, quote unquote, violence. I mean, look at Russia and Ukraine right now. Why fight for something that is inherently destructive? We've yet to find a nation state that isn't exclusive, that isn't imposing violence, that doesn't move from a second of decolonial, anti-colonial liberation movement to become something else. And in fact, without becoming too political science, which is not my forte, but it's not exactly like the representatives of the Palestinian state endeavors have been, quote unquote, working for the people. So there isn't really any sort of great, I think, trust or belief in this entity as a source of, globalizing power. I say also that it is generational, because I think one of the things I mentioned in the book is that I do believe that these, third generation Palestinian refugees are no longer in the place where they are comfortable with just having rights, Arendt's term, the right to have rights, or the rights to narrate. It's simply not enough. And I think they are arguing for the right to imagine, right? So the right to take part in what artists all over the world do, right? Thinkers and artists, the right to create, to imagine, and to not be pulled down, or the right to speak not one narrative over and over and over again, right? Or that moment is sort of like no longer sufficient, no longer enough. So I think that is part of why there is kind of also a resistance to ending the endeavor or the inspiration with the nation or national liberation. Your second question, which is really, really important, the question of restorative justice and reparation. I think this is a very important question. So I want to use it to make something clear. My critique of history is not of history as sort of like we should stop doing any historical work. It is a critique of the authority of history, capital H, the discipline, over what is considered archival research and what is considered important, right? Or what is considered a sort of a gate to constitutive knowledge, in the sense that that is sort of like what if we find, say, a document from, mind you, the Zionist state is profound in the sense of use. I mean, when you need a document, you can always go as far as the Ottoman Empire, right, to find what rights of land are distributed in what way. So yes, we can continue this. What I'm not saying that, all kind of restorative justice usually does, because it relies on legal endeavors, it does end up folding back to finding a document. It has nothing to do with ethics, of course. It's simply because the legal system needs that kind of final signature of the archival. So, of course, that needs to be done. And that is we don't have another mechanism for doing that. So that needs to be done. But for example, when Abu Rahme and Abbas go with the tours to the villages within 48 borders, the part of the emancipation of this act is that being there and collecting vegetation from there, or creating what they call an organic archive, is the political power, right? It is there. It's almost sort of to suggest the organic archive is there. And in that sense, there is no need to go and find the document that proves that once upon a time there was a village here. It is there. And there's an insistence in their work, and I think a very important one, to remind us that, particularly in the case of Palestine, where the time frame is very, very short, there is a present, and that present is saturated with past and future. And so in that context, when you think about the act of relying on the historical archive for justice and reparation, yes, you need to do this because that's how the liberal state works. But the limitation of that I think these artworks are proving is that it actually generates a fiction, one, that what we're talking about is the past, while it is the present, and the present is approachable. It's what I, in my second book in Visual Occupation, I say it's all about how to learn to see. It's all visible. One can train oneself to see what is hidden, and actually very actively hidden, so, but it's still all there. But the other thing that I think the work is to suggest is that, and not by rejecting the idea of reparation, etc., but to suggest that to be in a position of restorative justice and reparation is good just up to a certain degree, but it does maintain a kind of a subjecthood from which the beginning point is that of, if we want to use Agamben's all the way, it's like Homo Sacer is the beginning, and then you can kind of like just move up and up, right? You can gain rights and move into the position. But why accept that as a starting point? Yes, accept that that's what the liberal state does, and that's how the legal system works. But in the same time, that's not a place to begin with. That's not a place to begin with by asking for restoration. And there's also a, kind of, when one is in a position of restorative and reparation, one is de facto, once again, at the end of the day, thanking the IDF archive. So you see what I'm saying? There's a need, but I think there's, on my end and on the artist end, also a need to move away from that position, to move to a kind of a agency that decolonializes also that kind of mechanism, that kind of reliance. And your final question, sorry I'm taking so long, they are great questions, so I'm propelled. In terms of the audience, it's a great question. I think that, I think like, again, all other successful, talented artists, the audience is as large as can be. I think these are all circulating a very respectful Biennale kind of, artists. I think that it's very important for all of them to spread as wide as they can. I think that, they also celebrate that position, and in fact celebrate the fact that they really do bring Palestine onto the map of, global 21st century art events. They're not, sort of, it is quite amazing, actually, the power of visibility that artists of this caliber can bring to Palestine. The fact that people in the West are eager to, I'm not saying eager, maybe, sorry, I will take that back. But the fact that there is some kind of a consumption of, the authentic Palestinian as always and only a refugee in Gaza who, you know, barely has water and you know, all of which is true. But I think that all these artists really do, you know, insist on expanding the realm of what Palestine is, what being Palestinian is, what thinking about possibilities of becoming Palestine might be. So, and thank you.
Yeah.
Great questions.
Ziad.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me join you. It's an honor to share some thoughts with Gil and others. And one of the challenges of going last is that a lot has already been covered, and there's more pressure to make sure everything one says brings added value sometimes, if we want to use that terminology. Allow me first to start by saying that I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book. I've followed Gil's work since the second book, and then was a part of the editorial team when Gil published an essay article in Arab Studies Journal, and then have read this book with delight, and thinks it gives us a lot to work with, but also really opens up a variety of possibilities. So let me perhaps start my comments with just focusing on two broad aspects of the book that I think are really productive and really powerful. And then I'd like to maybe pose a few questions or make a few comments to try and maybe push the limits of what the book is trying to do, and to try and think of how it might help us do that. So the first is that, and perhaps most important, is that in its primary focus on the four sets of artists, Kamal al-Jafari, Larissa Sansour, Rawan Abu-Rahme, Basil Abbas, and Farah Saleh, I think Gil's book really takes seriously artists and artists working in very different mediums. If you think about these four sets of artists as knowledge producers, as participating in an active debate and discussion, both within Palestinian society and more transnationally. I think for me, both as a director of the MA in Human Rights and the Arts, and many of the conversations we've had, and as someone who's really grounded in Middle East studies, I think the necessity of taking artists and local, and I use local in quotations given that not all of them are in Palestine, but Palestinian, I think is really important. And what the work allows us to do is not just see their individual contributions as thinkers, as theorizers, as archivists, if Gil would permit me to use that, and as knowledge producers, and maybe even as activists in some ways, but also important themes and commonalities and differences between them. And so for me, that was one of the most important aspects of the work. The second aspect is perhaps a set of binaries or distinctions that the book makes, that even if we don't agree with all of them, force us to think quite intentionally, and the intentionality aspect here I think is very important, about why such distinctions matter, and trying to understand where we or they or whoever it is falls in these distinctions. So I'll highlight a few of them, although there are many more, so forgive me, Gil, if I'm not capturing the totality of the work. The first is I really appreciate the idea of activating the archive. And I think for us, that sets up the kind of distinction between a passive engagement with the archive versus an active engagement with the archive. And this is something you talk about in many ways, subtly and sometimes explicitly, about what the artists are doing, and in part of your introduction, kind of pushing us to think more about activating the archive. And that's something that as a historian, I struggled with when I collaborated with Tanya Al-Khouri on a archival-based lecture performance on the history of electricity in Lebanon, where archival documents become an active part of the performance and of what the audience is engaging with. And Tanya's pressure was always we need to activate this archive. We need to activate these documents. And so how do you activate that? So I really appreciate it. And I think what you provide and what you point to amongst these artists sheds light on a lot of possibilities for that. The second is, I think this emphasis on past-oriented versus present and future-oriented is really important. And I think we maybe take for granted sometimes political work and how much of it is past-oriented versus future-oriented and where the present fits into this. And so I think being much more cognizant of these orientations, if not in the work of people we're studying, but our own work as scholars or as activists or advocates or solidarity, people standing in solidarity, I think is really important and really useful. And again, I think you do an excellent job of demonstrating the future orientation of these artists and the works that they're doing. And finally, of course, this distinction between narrating versus imagining. And here I think narrating is about the past and imagining is about the future. Maybe sometimes it's about the present, but it's very much about, and how concerns with the past and the future are always present. And I think what Gil really points out is that there has been a bit of overemphasis in analysis on how people are concerned with the past and in analyzing the past. And what does it mean to take seriously people's concern with the future, not something reducible to a concern with the past? And what does that open up? So I think these distinctions are very productive and very helpful. And I learned a lot, both theoretically and empirically from the work. And I wish you could have been a part, Gil, in person of the 4-week module on archives in our methods seminar with the MA students in human rights and the arts, and the kind of wars, if you will, productive wars we had and they had amongst each other around questions of archives. So this is a very pertinent thing beyond the broader question of what's happening in the archive. Allow me to turn to a few comments or questions related to what's being said in the works. And here I look forward to as an opportunity to really understand the arguments more, or to try and think about maybe some of the potential consequences, for better or for worse, of the arguments. So Gil, one of the arguments you make, and you start out in your comments, is the claim that there's little redemptive political effect of the kind of traditional historical research that's how you justify the temporal focus of the work, right? We need to be present and future oriented because there's little redemptive political effect of the past orientation. And you're making a particular argument about Palestine here, but I wonder how much of that is only if we're thinking about the retrieval of the past or narrating the past vis-a-vis what the Zionist archive has to present. So you constantly return to the IDF archive, constantly return to the Zionist archive as showing that what is there is known, about how ultimately it's a thank you to the Zionist archive, it's a struggle over access. But I'm thinking of the works of people like, in addition to the premise of that there's little redemptive political effect, I think part of that argument is largely premised on the Zionist archive and what the Zionist archive can give us. But also I wonder how much of it is about the questions being asked. So when I think of those two things, and I think of the works of people like Shireen Say Ali, who I know you know well, or Mesna Qato, or any number of other people who have really pushed us to say there are a different set of questions we need to ask about the past. And in asking that, I think there has been tremendous redemptive political effect, because the effect has not been about understanding necessarily or proving Zionist settler colonialism or Zionist erasure or Zionist violence. In part, it's been about to bring to life things that have been erased and not within a nationalist framework, for that matter. And so, if you will, it's almost the bringing to life of how people in the past did imagine their future, but never, so I think there's something there about and this is separate from the fact of whether, there's still something redemptive politically from the Zionist archive and from showing what Israel did or did not do as a nation state. I tend towards your critique of that, but not the critique that in general past orientation has little redemptive political effect. So I wonder what happens if we shift what archives we're using and we shift the questions we're using, but we remain past oriented. Are we really without any useful political effect? The second, and of course, I'm cognizant that I am a historian, and trained as a historian, although I tend to, my joke is that in graduate school, what makes most historians is that they read other historians. I mean, if you think about it, we learn how to use the archive when we actually get to the archive. We don't actually get any training in how to use the archive before we get there. So, and in my mind, many people can be a historian. No offense to some of the esteemed historians who I look up to that are part of the audience and co-sponsors here. The second issue is, or question that I have is, the question of democratization of the archive. And I wonder, who is it against that this push to democratization is about? So when we say we want to democratize the archive, is it that we're democratizing it against professional historians? Is it that we're democratizing it against, the central authorities of nation states? Is it that we're democratizing it away from past orientation to future orientation? I think there's a little, more clarity that can come in that from you that I would like to hear about. And related to this is, I think you do a really powerful job of who makes archives, meaning democratizing at that level, and what archives can do and can't do. But I'm still left trying to think about, what is an archive? What becomes the legitimate basis to call something an archive? And I think, in your section in the book of what is an archive, you actually begin to answer that question, but then move quickly to who makes an archive and what can you do with an archive? But we're still left with the question of what is an archive? How is it different from a collection? How is it different from a document or an artifact or a reel of film, right? What combination of factors constitutes an archive, even if we want to think of it in a way that is critical of traditional historians and historiography and state archives, right? Even if we want to think of alternative archives, if everything is an archive, then nothing is an archive in my view, right? So there has to be some grounds to parse out what is an archive. And I'm still left trying to think about what is an archive, even if I believe and agree with the work that you do in the book that these artists are producing archives of the present and the future, right? So that I agree with, but I would like to hear a little bit more about what is an archive, right? In that sense. And then finally, and by the way, these are intense debates in the field of history and outside of history. So my pushing the question is simply to better understand your contribution, which I think you're making quite productively. And then finally, I think if you know, like we could go in a number of ways with this third comment, but I guess it would be less a question about the archive and more about history. Just so they don't say that I'm a historian on this panel and didn't try to defend it in some ways. So you have this really powerful point in your comments and in your response to the questions about a critique of history as the exclusive domain of constitutive knowledge of some kind, right? And the attempt to democratize that. But here, I think the focus on these artists is valid and important and makes a huge contribution, but doesn't necessarily have to be justified in a critique of history, because history, by definition, is concerned with the past. So at the very moment, and so its only contribution to constitutive knowledge is actually about the past. So I think as soon as you say, I'm not interested in the past, I'm interested in the present or the future, right? It's totally legitimate to sideline history. I mean, not totally, but I mean, it becomes a different issue, right? So that's when you need to turn to, for example, in a research methods class, we'd say that's when you need to turn to ethnography, right? There are historical methods, and then there are methods that are not past oriented, but present, and you're showing future oriented methods, I think. So I think there is a tension there that, is it fair to critique history in that way if history is concerned with the past, and you're saying we should not be concerned with the past, we should be concerned with the future, like these artists are concerned, right? That's less a critique of history, since history defines itself as dealing with the past, than a critique of being concerned with the past. Again, this is all very productive for me as a historian and as a director of the MA in Human Rights and the Arts at Bard College. And I bring these questions to you very humbly, because in the grand scheme of things, I learned a tremendous amount, both theoretically and empirically, from your work. And I'm very appreciative of being here with all of you.
Thank you so much, Ziad. Really wonderful comments, and again, very, very productive for me. So I'll start with the end, just because first I want to give due respect to historians, but I also just want to make clear, because I don't think I say, and I do focus the importance on future-oriented approach to the archive, and that's what I ascribe to activization. But I don't think I actually do at any point in the book sort of throw away the past, nor do any of the artworks that I talk about, right? So of course, there's a continuum of, you know, the argument is not about, oh, we should ignore the past, or we should, you know, the argument is more about the teleology of history as a narrative, and sort of the idea that you know, if we find the facts, or if we're archaeologists and we dig out the facts, then we will know the truth, and then we will have the facts, and then we can, you know, understand where we are and who we are, etc. So the argument is really about that that authority, which is in the grip, which I talk about, which is a very, very strong grip, right? In addition to the fact that, as you probably know, it is still the case that within the modern constitutions of disciplines, which we all know are completely invented and didn't exist before the 19th century, but since people have become professionalized historians, professionalized this, professionalized that, historians in history, for some reason, do continue to hold a kind of different place in the disciplinary realm world of the humanities, which is soon about to disappear altogether from the world. But as long as it exists, there still is some kind of thing that I talked about before, which is, you know, history is for serious, and then imagination or art is, you know, for that's for, like, you know, people who I don't know, they have some extra time, or so it's really about that. And so about these two elements, not about the rejection of the past, and none of the works are. I mean, of course, the past is also immersed in the present and the future. I even want to mention, because I as you were talking in the book, I talk at some point about Roland Barthes' argument that any text is a new tissue of past citations, right? So that is my reading of archive, and that's why archives can be, and that will lead me to your next question, can always be activated, because we're talking about tissues of citations, right? So again, it's the almost the idea of activization versus the kind of final word of the document, right? Because if every document is a tissue of citation, then of course you cannot have like a final word of it. You have to kind of do something with it, examine it, unfold all the tissues that are there, like a surgeon. So that really is what I meant by that. And so I'm glad that this helped me clarify. The question of that you ask about what is an archive. So as you know, especially in as a director of the MA in your program, it's almost been, there's been sort of like, you're right, since Derrida published his book, The Archive, in 95, I think from 95 to 2002, there's been sort of an obsession of theoretical work with the question, what is the archive? Was nobody answering that question, primarily because every person engaged, every theoretical engagement with it has had a different understanding of what the archive is, right? So let me start by saying that, you know, you have the most extreme kind of abstraction of the archive, which is Foucault's, right? Foucault, I read the quote is, the archive is the law of what can be said, the system that governs the appearance of statements as unique events. Okay, so of course, for Foucault, the archive is actually a mechanism, right? It's whatever can appear, among it, the archive as we know it, like the dusty archive. And so somewhere between that to the most kind of, you know, common sense understanding of what is an archive. An archive is a collection that has been officially recognized as a source of information. It usually still does take place today by state, state power, and we all know that it's, you know, curated and it's organized, and that's an archive. So somewhere between the, one could say, the extreme theoretical and also paranoid version of Foucault, to archive is just like a collection of, you know, of documents from the past that are organized. Somewhere between them, I think, is what an archive is. And I think it's very hard to decide, because you do have the one extreme is the most kind of, which I don't think there's any person still believing, a naive sort of like an archive is the gate to the past, right? I mean, nobody today really thinks that you just storm into the state archive and you find the truth. I mean, even I think the most unsophisticated historians don't think that way. That would be naive to think that anybody thinks that way. To the other extreme, which is kind of like the, you can't trust any document, because the minute it's called archive, it has been curated and has been already set in a certain order, etc. And that's like the extreme paranoid version of what an archive is. I think we do move in between that, and you know, in a way, I would go as far as to suggest that this is an archive. This book is an archive. It's because the act of, you know, back to you and your program, the act of curation is an act of archiving, right? When you curate, you archive. You put certain texts, works, etc., in a certain order that you give them, and that you have people look at them at that way. There is one place in the book where I mention, let's see if I can find it. I I mentioned Padma, which is the collective Padma, and they have this wonderful online 10 thesis on the archive. And one of the things that I took from them is that they suggest that there are two approaches to the archive. The first involves minorities, whether ethnic, sexual, religion, or otherwise, who are, quote unquote, waiting for the archive, by which they mean they're waiting to become part of the hegemonic, usually state archive. They're waiting to have an invitation into the legitimate narrative. The second involves a risk-taker position, which replaces waiting by making. And this approach replaces the plea for recognition and inclusion with creating alternative archives that are radically incomplete collectives. So again, yes, it is a binary, and I of course see that, you know, there's more than these two options. But I think this differentiation between waiting and making, or between, you know, what you were mentioning before, this idea of activization, I think that's where the difference lies. Is wine going to, you know, find oneself, look for oneself in the archive, or is one going to actively engage with the archive and become a maker? To your final and very important question about asking different questions about the past, brilliant question, wonderful comment. And I think it's very important to remember that, yes, Shireen's work, of course, I know very well and think very highly of, and there are many others. But remember also that there is in that work, not just different questions, but also really an opening to engaging different material as important archives, right? So it is also a broadening of what counts as a legitimate archive for telling historical narratives. So yeah, but I actually think that this idea I will take very seriously, because you're very right that it's also about not just what one engages, but what kind of questions activate that historical archive. And I think that's very, very important. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. Ziad, especially I want to thank you for that comment about anybody that giving license to other non-historians to do historical work, because as somebody who has sinned in that and has gotten flack from many historians, this is very liberating. This is really fascinating, and I have to say that that the irony of, in some ways, using in some ways a kind of somewhat a Zionist, I guess, nation building methodology to think about Palestinian identity is really interesting. I mean, as we know, maybe the father of modern Zionism's famous dictum is, if you will it isn't fiction. And so the imagination and works of art were so important to early Zionist thought, for sure. And Gil, I'm very curious. I would still push you a little further about this question of what is an archive, because as I was listening to you and as I was reading your book, and I was thinking, in some ways, why do you need the word archive in there? I mean, why is it not performativity or speech act or another way of calling this type of political engagement? Why does it have to be called the creation of an archive?
Well, I think because we still live in a world where the access to the truth, quote unquote, or to facts is called archive, and it's still privileged. So when I suggest that these artists are creating archives, and that they are, important to engage with, not just as works of art, but as political understanding of our world, I want to underscore that it is as important to engage with Saleh, for example, dance, as it is to go to the archive and look for material. Because, and by the way, not every art is archived, but these are specific works that actually work with archival material. right?
Right.
So they're inherently archival, but they also do something more, and that, you know, you can go back to Walid Rad and his, you know, infamous invented archive, but they insert the speculative into the factual, right? And they force us to rethink archives, also along the line of you know, the main division that usually the archive is supposed to clear for us: real, not real, happen, not happen, fiction, not fiction. I think all of these works are insisting that it's actually a line that you cannot find and you should not find, because that is the violence of the archive. Now, that is what the archive, the moment an archive is created, you have a certain kind of authority over the truth, right? And so there is kind of an insistence that to draw out actually the speculative that is part of the quote unquote factual archive. So that, yeah, that's why.
We have one question, and we have really like 4 minutes, so maybe we should really could answer quickly. This question is from Nancy Stern, who's thanking you for the event, and she's saying, I'm wondering if you could help me understand the complex ideas of the book by relating them to the recent news of the Tantura massacre, especially the film and the news stories relied on different types of archives. So yeah, maybe just in like 3 minutes, if you can answer it. If not, then I'm sure I'm sure audience
I'd like to engage with that. That's a great question, and thank you. It's a great question because it does bring a very concrete example. So first, I want to say this is an opportunity to see why, of course, the past matters. But I also want to say, yes, there is an engagement here with an alternative archive, which is an oral archive, right? Not the actual archived archive. So it is a creation of an archive. This is the film is precisely a creation of an archive. And I think it's an opportunity to remember that historical approaches to archives have only recently really have taken as seriously oral documentation, because they are not documented and archived, and there's still always questions about the sort of the you know, or you even have notions of societies that are not good at archiving, right? Indigenous Americans or Native Americans, they're just not archival societies. I mean, what is this crazy idea? It is the idea that, you know, that oral history is not archiving. It's not a collecting of a past. It's you know, so I think this is a wonderful example where you have a new source of information, which is oral. That said, I also want to say something very interesting for those who follow the release of the film, the new film Tantura has happened, with the way it has been circulated, at least in the Israeli press, which I have seen, which is very alarming, which is, this is very important to release all this new information, because this is the only way that Israel can become a strong Zionist democracy, because it will document even more vigorously its crimes. Now, this has been an ongoing process, right? Why is the IDF the most unique army in the world? Because it documents its crimes. So I have seen this because I have followed this, and I've followed the film itself is remarkably important, very enlightening, and so I do think that, you know, the place of oral history is very important, but the way that it has been inscribed into a further ethical position and bettering the Zionist democracy is just sort of mind-blowing. So I guess it's a great opportunity to see that, again, I say at some point in the book, no archive, nothing is inherently emancipatory. you know, there isn't like some kind of a promise in an archive. The archives can do many things, and that is true. And you can bend truth, you can bend facts, you can do all kinds of things. So it's all about what kind of acts are done with archive, and you know. So thank you for this question.
Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions, but I'm sure you can find Gil in his email on the Columbia website and buy her book and engage with her. And I'm sure she will appreciate that. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Ziad. Thank you, Renee and Sheldon and other people who've made this possible behind the screens, per se. And thank you all for joining us, and come back for other Rifkind Center events.
Thank you, Michal. Thank you, everybody. And yes, I would welcome anybody who has questions too. You know, there is nobody who doesn't like to be engaged on their own work. So it's easy to find me, and I promise to answer with a detailed email. And thank you again, Diana, and thank you, Ziad, and thank you, Renee and Sheldon, for making this possible. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. It was great to be a part of this. Great to meet you both, Gil and Ziad, and
Thank
Michal as
you.
well. Hope to see you
Thank
on
you.
campus sometime soon.